There we go. All right. First part of the talk got started. Check. Sweet. I love getting applause for no reason, so just keep it going. So, as you heard, my name is Yuna, and I'm here to show you how to do cool things with CSS Houdini. Who here has heard of Houdini before? All right, there's like 5 of you. So, who here has used Houdini in production? Yeah, that's not a thing because it's not production ready. It's very experimental, but you can do fun things. So that's why I'm here to talk to you about how to do those things. So as you heard, my name is Yuna, and you can find me on the internet at these various places. I was a Google developer expert. I create like technical illustrations called dev doodles on Instagram. I'm trying to spread the knowledge outside of Twitter. Also have a bi-weekly podcast called Tools Day, which is about tech tools, tips, and tricks, pretty much front-end development and web development there. And I recently started a YouTube channel where I sometimes sing songs about array methods. But next week I'm joining Google, so this is my 1 week of fun employment between jobs. It's a good time. I'm going to go hang out on the beach. But hopefully today I will have been able to teach you about, wins and limitations of CSS today. There's actually a lot of really cool new things in CSS that gives us a lot of power as developers. I'm going to talk about Houdini, what it is, all the different APIs of Houdini, and then we're going to dive into a few of those. I'm going to talk about how to use Houdini and actually go into a live demo, hoping that works out okay. We'll see. And then I'm going to talk about how to get a little extra with CSS Houdini. So, code has definitely evolved over time. I love this meme. When I was a pup, I had one toy, and it was a stick. I feel like a lot of time we hear web developers talk this way, but CSS has evolved so much. Like back in the day, it was like you had a couple of layouts, and they were right side fixed and then stretch the rest of your layout, or like right and left side fixed and the middle stretch, and those were like your 2 Dreamweaver options that were available as boilerplates. And that was like the original Flexbox. But now we have things like CSS Grid that really gives us a lot of control over both horizontal and vertical spacing. Are you all familiar with Grid? Have you used Grid? Okay, I can tell there's a lot of JavaScript developers here, but oh my gosh, Grid is so good. Let me show you why. So, inside of my CSS, I can literally define a grid template, and you can use emojis even to stand in for this grid template. So I have a header here. I can physically show you it's taking up the entire width of my template area. You can specify the height. So this header height is 4 rems. I could change it to 8, make it taller. Then this space here is 400 pixels, and there's auto spacing of the content underneath that. So you could just take the rest of the space. There's fractional units that are brand new in CSS. I could change and rearrange how this entire sidebar works. So if I don't want the header to go all the way across, I can just run it, and now the sidebar goes all the way up and down. So Grid really does give us a ton of control over our layouts, and it makes it a lot easier to style the web. And another really exciting thing for people who like to do visual code are CSS custom properties. And what these allow us to do are finally have dynamic variables in CSS. So when you had Sass, you could use variables before, but they always got compiled into actual values. So they weren't true dynamic variables. But here I've set a primary color, hot pink. That's the color that we're showing up here on the H1. I have a background color of wheat. That's sort of the background that we see here. But then I could take this and update it dynamically. So inside of JavaScript, you can create like a change background function where it accepts the color, and we can set the property of background from JavaScript into our CSS. So we no longer have to have these static variables or rewrite the style on top of that property in like the style tag within the div, like people are doing now. I could just write change background and put any value, yellow, because CSS accepts color values, and then run that. Now my background is yellow. So you can take that a step further and really just, I like to use mouse move to show like how dynamic this can be. I'm going to delete this. So now what I'm doing is I'm just calling change background with the client X location, so that when I'm moving this left to right, that color is changing, and you can see the mouse location. So we can take that even a step further and use two values and have a rainbow, a panoply of colors, if you will. That's a good word. I never use that word. So now I'm just showing this like dynamic color change and movement across the page. And all we're doing, we're not overwriting information in the DOM. We're sending that information into CSS where it should be styled, and it makes perfect semantic sense because we're separating these concerns. So CSS custom properties are super exciting. I'll be talking about those throughout the conversation. But don't get too excited because there's a lot that we still can't do in CSS. And one of those things is form styling. Who here has ever had to style a form? Yeah. That's always like the bane of our existence, right? It's the best part of being a web developer. And, accessibility just goes right out the window when you remake those forms. But then I started looking into, okay, what does the web's resources say about form styling? So I started looking, and all right, that's kind of what I want to do, that custom form, like a blue background, something like that with custom typography. How do we do this? All right, so first you have to write out your HTML, make it semantic. Great, options, that makes sense. And then you go into your CSS. Cool, that's kind of what I expect when I want to style a form, seeing CSS. And then it goes into this JavaScript. And I get really frustrated because this is a requirement to style things like forms. So we can't really do that on the web yet. And sure, there's reasons, and I think that on mobile it looks a lot better than it does on desktop, but it's a frustration for people who do visual coding. Gradients are really cool, and gradients are something that we can write in CSS now. I can sort of break this up and show you how this background is built. So it starts with a gradient that goes from the right to left, navy to red color. And then on top of that, I'm layering a circle, and I can position that circle to be 50%, 120%, which is a little bit, it's centered and then off center from the bottom, from yellow to transparent, so it's blending into the rest of the gradient. And then I have this linear gradient, this magenta line that's kind of going across the top. And then on top of that, I have this navy line that's over and up to the right corner, and then on top of that I have a circle. So you can just layer and layer and layer these things, and it's really quite magical. You no longer have to create these in Photoshop and then pull them into your document. So that is something that is really well supported, and we can use that on the web today. Cool. Conic gradients, however, are not so well supported. Conic gradients basically allow for you to start at one point and then go in a circular pattern instead of a radial pattern or a linear pattern. If you want this to be a full circle, I can just continuously put dark orange at the beginning and end. So this just recently got supported by one browser, and that's Chrome, but nobody else really supports conic gradients. This is something that you can polyfill, and you can also polyfill it with Houdini. Animated gradients are another example of something that we don't currently have the ability to do in CSS. So here I have a gradient going from red to pink, and I want to update that to go from blue to pink, but the browser doesn't understand how to interpolate these values because it's just sort of reading them as strings, and there's no semantic meaning to them right now. So that's not something that's currently possible. Custom borders are another example. Like, you do have a lot of control if you mix borders and shadows and outlines and things like that. But if you're trying to do something outside of just a line or a box with a radius on it, you kind of get stuck and you hit a point. So you can't really do non-standard borders. But that's where Houdini comes in. Yay! And if you're wondering what Houdini is, I'm sure glad that you asked, or I asked for you. Houdini is a low-level API for CSS, or more specifically, it is a set of APIs, browser APIs, that allow developers to access the CSS object model for the first time ever. So that looks like this. Right now, if you design something on the web that doesn't exist on the web and you want to style it, you create a JavaScript polyfill. So the browser goes through this cascade layout paint composite step and then has to go through that again because the DOM is now reloading with this JavaScript applied on top of it. With Houdini, you can apply styles, the paint step, the layout step. All these different worklets allow for you to apply these styles from the beginning, from the CSS part, and your browser can understand the CSS that you as a developer are writing. So as a developer, we can now tell the browser how we want it to read our CSS. That is like super, super exciting. So that's why I love Houdini. And so it's a lot faster too when you go through these steps because you don't have to do it twice. So another exciting thing about Houdini is while browsers are sort of creating these larger pushes towards specific properties and methodologies and ways we write, you can write a little polyfill. It could be this little dog, the small dog, just zooming along, and from there you can just not have to wait for the browser. You can write your own code. So there's a great website called ishoudinireadyyet.com for all of your Houdini needs, and this website links to all the specs. It links to all the details you need about those work in progress specs. A lot of them are on GitHub, and what support exists in what browser. So this is kind of like your can I use for Houdini. And so we're going to mostly be doing our example with the Paint API because it's pretty well supported, but I'll also talk about layout, typed object model, properties and values and things like that. So let's get started with the Properties and Values API. So as I showed you before, CSS variables, super, super handy. CSS variables are CSS custom properties. And this API allows us to really extend CSS variables, like CSS variables and then more. So the syntax to register a custom property looks like this. You start by giving a name, you give it a syntax, a semantic meaning for it to understand its value from, an initial value, and then you can say if it inherits or not from its parent. So let's go back to that example of this animating gradient. So this, again, is not currently possible, but what we can do to make it possible is register a property. So here I've created a property called color stop. I could call it anything. I can call it like color YGLF. And then in my style, what I'm trying to do here is transition that color, but it's not understanding what I'm trying to do because there's no syntax to it. But I'm applying the syntax of color to this property that I'm registering so that it now understands what this means. So if I update all of my color variables to color YGLF, and then I can transition that, I update it here on the hover. Now when I run it, it's going to transition. So we've now registered a property. Thank you. Like I said, just keep it going, it's fine. So now we've created a property and we allow for the browser to understand what it should be interpolating. So the current syntax is available for this worklet, this API, I mean, as length, number, percentage, color, image, URL, integer, equal time. So there's a few different things that you can do here and teach the browser how you want it to understand your code. So another cool thing about custom properties is you can set default values. So what I mean is this. In my style, I am not writing the actual value of color primary or color secondary, but I have a box, and when I hover it, you see it goes from that purple color to this pink color. Inside of the JavaScript, what I'm doing is I'm setting this initial value to blue-violet and deep pink. So that's my color primary, blue-violet, and then it converts to deep pink. So if I wanted to update this value, I could update the color primary and set it to red. And if I ran that, it would update. So you can override these. But if I had no value here or an invalid value like 23, it would go back to the deep purple. It doesn't just ignore it. Now CSS ignores lines that are, don't make any sense. So if I have a line that doesn't make any sense like this, it just ignores the line. That's sort of the beauty of it, in that the error is just, it doesn't appear. So there's no color there, it will transition to the next one. But it allows for you to type check what you're setting these variables as. So if I have that value, it will fall back to the default of the purple color. If I update it, then it has a value that it can read from and update to. So this is kind of like typing your CSS variables, you're type checking to make sure that there's no errors there. And I think that's really cool for things like design systems and for CSS that you're writing as a part of a library or a system. So that kind of brings us to the typed object model, and this is sort of how the browser will read and understand your CSS. So currently, the CSS object model is string-based. This spec introduces a new way to interact with underlying values by representing them with specialized JavaScript objects that can be manipulated and understood more easily and reliably than just string parsing and concatenation. So the browser will have something that it can hold onto these specialized JavaScript objects to understand what it's reading in an easier way. So these CSS values become typed JavaScript objects. Right now, this is sort of like how the browser reads JavaScript. It looks for rule sets, declarations, it looks for specific key values, and it just reads it all as strings. So that's kind of why that interpolation wasn't working before. But with a typed object model, you can get the set value or computed value, and it returns a CSS unit value. So I think this is a little bit easier to show than tell, and I'm just going to inspect in the browser. I don't even know, that's some plugin. Okay, so let me just make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to inspect this paragraph, and in Chrome, if you just do $0, you actually get that specific element. It's super useful. So if we did $0.computed style map, and then we get the height, now we get the CSS keyword value, and that's new. This is the Houdini update in this browser. It's supported in Chrome. So we get value auto. We can also set this to like height, let's say 100 pixels. So now we just updated this to 100 pixels, and I could run the same get computed style map, and we get a value. Oh, looks like we're getting a really weird value. But you get a unit and a value, and now the browser kind of understands what it's reading, so it can compute and read the CSS faster. That's sort of the idea behind what the CSS object model API allows. So that's pretty cool. Next, I want to talk about the paint worklet, which is by far my favorite because I love visual development and I love doing weird things in the web. So I'm going to pause for a second and talk about worklets in general because they work a little bit different than some of the Houdini APIs I talked about before this. But with the worklets, they kind of work like service workers. Have you all used service workers in your own work and websites? Who has? Raise your hands. Okay, a few of you. Like Kyle said, they're great for caching offline content, pre-rendering assets, sending push notifications, things like that. And it's because they live in a layer between the network and the website that you're on. So they can return you those assets that you don't have available if you're in the subway, things like that. Worklets in Houdini work similarly in that they live in this separate thread. They live outside of your website, outside of the network, and they kind of can speak back to the website as you need them, which is why when we develop with Houdini, we have to use HTTPS or localhost in order to have it work. And the reason we have that with service workers as well is because you could have malicious requests this way, so you have to make sure that you're safe. So here's an example of using the Paint API, the Paint worklet. We first have to create a sort of worklet to register. And in this example from Will Boyd, he is basically just using Canvas to start from the top left, go to the bottom right, start from the top right and go to the bottom left and create these X's. So we're creating these sort of placeholder paint boxes. And that's what we see in this mock-up. So at the end of this, we register paint. Inside of our HTML, we have to then go and add the worklet. And we add it to the CSS interface, css.paintworklet.addModule. And then he has a lot of these class placeholders in here. So in the style, we can then style the placeholders by just saying background image paint placeholder box, which we named in that worklet file that we just registered. So it sort of looks like this. In JavaScript, you have a class that you're registering, and so that could be a paint, a layout. You have to give it a name. Then you can invoke that worklet file in the HTML, so you add it to the CSS interface that the browser is now going to read and understand. And then in CSS, you can use the worklet by the name that you gave it inside of your JavaScript. So you can access that in CSS. Whew, okay, so like Bruce said, is this JavaScript in CSS? Absolutely, this is JavaScript in CSS. But I think what is really cool about this is you're separating that concern of style and semantics, because you can write JavaScript that is style code that you are then styling inside of your CSS. So if you have a library, you can just import it and then use it like you would expect to in your CSS. Here's an example of something that I kind of just was playing around with. I created this rainbow ties worklet, just kind of like going through and updating colors based on the size that we have in the rectangle. And then again, you css.paintwork.add module, you add it to that space. And then here I can just access it with background image, paint rainbow ties, which is what I called it, or whatever name you give it. So back to that little conic gradient. The way that you can do that here is you can use existing polyfills, and it goes through this whole example. This is from css-houdini.rocks, which is a great resource for a lot of awesome Houdini demos. But the cool thing about this is it actually can also take arguments. So inside of your CSS, you can call this paint conic gradient, and then all of our arguments are listed here. So if I wanted to add a color and have that be a continuous circle, I can add it inside of the CSS, and then it can read that conic gradient, understand that transformation that we want the CSS to understand from the ground up, and then apply that paint. So it's pretty cool. It's kind of magical. I think it's the future. So let's talk about layout. Layout is another one that is very work in progress, but the CSS Layout API is designed to give developers the ability to write their own layout algorithms in addition to the native algorithms that the user agent ships with today. What does that mean? Today's layouts give us float and block flow. Flexbox is a layout type. Grid is a layout algorithm that the browser gives us today. But in the future, layout might not just be on that screen, right? We're already seeing it on watches or in your cars or on refrigerators. You might have constraint-based layout that's specific to your product. If you create a product with a specific interface or dashboard that you want to use the web to style, because the web is everywhere. Masonry you can create with Houdini and use that. You can create vertical rhythm for even spacing of lines and have your text snap to a line by using Houdini. These are sort of what we'll have in the future, what we're trying to do in the future with layout. Layout could be writing books inside of the web. People have done that already. Leah Verou's book, CSS Secrets, is written in a web browser, and then using print style sheets, she's able to style it. I think that's really cool. So it looks kind of like this. You can get the children, edges, constraints, style maps of the parents and then use those to style things. So an example I think is always better to see what that looks like. This one's called random.js. It is from Google Chrome Labs Houdini samples. So Surma's really involved with Houdini over at Google. And so inside of this document, what he's basically doing is getting each child fragment of the parent and then setting a random location to the inline and block size and then pushing that to just appear in that random location. So if I refresh this and run it again, all these blocks are going to be generated in a random position in that layout. And so with the CSS, basically we just write one line, display layout random, and then all the divs inside of that just get a width and height so you can see where they're appearing. And so when we run it, you get just randomized layout. And so we can write that layout algorithm in Houdini and have the browser understand our layout, our custom layout. So here's an example of masonry. So kind of just going through and looking to adjust the elements here in the best way possible. So like you can increase padding, you could increase columns, and then these values, these divs will sort of snap if there's a better position according to the top left or top right, if you write it that way, of the screen to sort of flow and fit best. Like Pinterest sort of does this. A lot of different apps do this sort of thing. So that's something that's really popular that you can write with Houdini. So now I want to talk about the animation worklet, and this one's very experimental, so I actually have to open my DevTools. In DevTools, I have cache disabled when I have DevTools open. I don't know why. when Kyle was talking this morning about how JavaScript is not slow, it's not fragile. Houdini is slow and fragile. It's a work in progress. So with the CSS animation worklets, these things that Houdini is now giving us, it's a new primitive for creating scroll-linked and other high-performance procedural animations on the web. So what does that mean? The Web Animation API is really cool. It's also pretty new. The Web Animation API gave us an animation timeline, so you could go sort of forward, back, reverse at any point of that timeline. It gave us document and effect timing, so you could time things after other effects have ended, and that's cool, or any sort of point within that timeline. And also a keyframe model. So like, you know, we heard about Flash this morning. I personally love Flash. I had a lot of fun with Flash. Something that the web was missing was definitely having those keyframes that you can kind of access and move through when you're creating these web animations or interactions. And so we got that with the Web Animation API. Now with the animation worklet, what we are getting are scroll-linked animations and dedicated threads that run parallel and don't sort of clog up your JavaScript, which is super, super cool. And that's because the way that these Houdini worklets work with your browser. So it kind of looks like this, where it's just being called whenever you need an update for that style, whether that be the paint worklet or the animation or the layout. Here's an example, again from Google Chrome Labs, where Surma's creating this little icon that goes to the top, like in Twitter, when you scroll through, and it stays there. And then this next example sometimes works. Nope. I thought that opening this worked like twice today, but then it didn't work 3 times today. Anyway, it's supposed to like spring and stay fixed at the top. I'm not even showing you the code for this because it's so work in progress and also doesn't work all the time, as you can see. So just imagine what this looks like, and maybe maybe it'll work on your system. I'm doing a live demo later, so fingers are crossed for me. Note that today the Animation API will only animate fast properties like opacity and transform, and only items that can be composited. But this is a good sort of thing to do anyway when you are creating CSS animation or interaction. The transform and opacity properties take the least amount of sort of recompositing, repainting, going through all those different geometric layout steps. So it's kind of a best practice to only use those when you are using interaction and animation anyway. So now let's make some magic. Let's do a demo. So note, this is experimental, if you didn't catch that already. You should go and enable experimental web platform features for the best hopes of this working the way that it should. And you can do that at this URL on Chrome. Also, caveats are that you must use HTTPS or localhost for reasons I went over, and that's because you're sort of outside of your browser bubble, and we get a lot of great benefits for that, but it could be bad for security. And also, if you have issues with refreshing, sometimes having disable your browser cache, like I had a setting for disable browser cache when DevTools is open, thought that it would fix that other problem, but you know, it works every other day. So the way to check in JavaScript is you could check for if paint worklet in CSS, and then you can also check in CSS by using @supports. @supports is pretty well supported, except for in Internet Explorer right now, so just be cognizant of that, keep that in mind. But you can use @supports by putting the property that you are checking for support from inside of the parentheses. So if you're looking for support with paints, if you put background paint something, if the browser can understand that, then it will read whatever is inside of those curly braces, or curly boys as I like to call them. So let's start with Canvas. I have created a code pen that I'm going to open up here. And so this is sort of the starter. Let me open this in a new window because I want to go back to my talk. And here I'm going to also zoom in because I'm sure that you can't really see. All right, that's a little too big. How's that? Can everyone read that? I'll be talking through it. So basically what we have here is a page with a canvas, and the canvas has just a width and height, and then the body is not much styling. I'm just showing you where the canvas is. And then inside the JavaScript, I am just having a randomize function, but that takes two numbers. I'm looking for the canvas, and then I'm getting the context from that. I'm setting a height and width on the canvas, and then I have a min-max height for the height of the sparkle, for the width of the sparkle, and then for the weight of the sparkle, how thick it is. I'm setting a color there, and then I have just, using the getRandom function to position it on the page. Then I'm setting the line width as the stroke width, the color, that was yellow up there, and then I'm using Canvas to paint it. So I'm starting top to bottom, drawing that sparkle in left to right, moving it to the right position, and then we finally draw it. So one sparkle is a lot of fun, but what's even more is multiple sparkles. So let's add how many sparkles we want. So maybe we want like 30 sparkles. So let's write a variable like 30. And then we can take everything inside of here that we're updating, right? So we are going to put this inside of a little loop. So here we'll just say for let I equal 0, and then we will say I is less than sparkles, and then I plus plus. And, okay, don't worry, I see it. Okay, so now we have multiple sparkles appearing. Cool. But maybe we don't want all of our sparkles to be yellow. Maybe we want some more hues in there. So I have this little hue function where I'm setting HSL, and I'm keeping it in the yellow range. So the hue is only 20 values that it can be between 40 and 60. Saturation is also pretty saturated, and then the luminosity is going to be a little bit lighter and darker, so whenever I'm running this, I'm going to get some different sparkles every time. Cool. So that's really fun. But this is a canvas, and this is not a Houdini worklet yet. And so in order to do that, let's just remove all the canvas stuff, right? Removing it, let's put a header in here, maybe H1 hello world. Okay, then we want to go inside of our CSS, give it a color of white so you could see it. I'm going to do a display inline block so it doesn't go all the way across the page, so when we have this effect, you'll see that it sticks to that. And we want to go in here and remove all of these sort of canvassy things. We don't need canvas and context. We don't need the width and height set anymore because we're going to be pulling that from our element itself. All right, so the next step is then to, maybe we want to do like a type check. Another way to check for support is if type of register paint is not equal to undefined, because you're checking for if the browser understands what a register paint is. So here we then want to create a class, so we'll write class sparkles, and then inside of this we can call paint, and the paint will accept a context and a size, which we will use to paint. Cool, so after all of this we want to then register the paint, and here we're going to give it a name, sparkles. And we're going to call from this class sparkles. And we want to move all this stuff inside of that class. So now we want to move this into the class. So we have something that we are painting, and we have some variables going, we have some context here. Another thing that we have to do is update the size, so we no longer are setting width and height. We have to set size.width and size.height so that it can actually pull from the elements. Okay, so I'm going to save that. But the next step is to go into our HTML and actually register this so that we can use it. Well, there's a couple steps here. So here I'm going to use script, and then I'm going to say CSS. So we're on the CSS interface, css.paintWorklet.add module. And the way that you can sort of fake this in CodePen is you can copy this pen path, and you can use that path.javascript, and it's going to be calling like this right there. I'm also going to now open my DevTools because sometimes this works and sometimes doesn't. Cool. So the next step would be to, in CSS, apply this with a background. So background paint, and the name that we gave it is sparkles. And if everything worked out fine, we see sparkles. Yay! high pressure. Okay, so we see that as we also move the browser, it repaints, and that's because the browser is going to be styling that every time because the layout changed. I think that's actually going to be fixed. But if we want to go through and update the style here so we can make it sort of animate, I could say at keyframes sparkle. And so inside of here we'll get a from and a to. And so we can, inside of these two, rewrite background paint sparkle, and then go into our header and give it an animation, and that will be animation sparkle 0.25 seconds infinite linear, and it'll just continue to update and change. Oh, it's called sparkle. Great. Okay, cool. So that was me. So now, in theory, once this loads, also sometimes, like I said, it is slow and clunky. Why won't you update? Oh, here's where you know what? That's what's happening. Cool. Okay, so now, if that's all correct, it'll animate and sort of blah, blah, blah on the screen. We're sparkly. Okay, so in case that didn't work, here's a link. Another really interesting thing that you can do that I stole from IMVideo, who created css-houdini.rocks, which is the best resource on Houdini that I've been able to find, is this technique for using a worklet to just evaluate a variable, which is so clever, because that means that in the SCSS we can write this entire thing as a variable called background canvas. And so inside of this we can paint background canvas, and that is all contained inside of the CSS. So I thought that was kind of clever. Some things to note, some caveats to this approach. It is semicolon sensitive, so you can't just ignore those semicolons. Also, variables must be there at instantiation. You can't just create a variable and then call it with different elements. I've tried that. It has to be that whole block of information when you want to use it. But I do want to sort of take this and reorganize it with custom properties. So we can go back into our example here, and sort of a better way to do this would actually be to make this more dynamic. So if I removed sparkles from this worklet and wanted to use maybe a variable called like sparkle number inside of here, we can say sparkle num, and then maybe we want to use 10 so that we can see the difference there. We can go into our class, and before the paint we can get those methods. So the way that we're going to do this is static get input properties, and so we want to then return a array here of the input properties that we're going to get. So in this case it's going to be sparkle num, so we're going to be returning this, looking for sparkle num, and then here, because it doesn't understand sparkles anymore, we're going to be updating that to proper. Well, before we do that, we have to then send properties inside of here, so properties, and then within here we can update this to properties .get, and then we're looking for sparkle num, and so if I save that, it will find that it's only 10, so it's a lot fewer sparkles. I can update this to 5 and refresh. I can update it to 35 and it'll update. And sort of a better way to have this update for the animation purposes is to use this variable and to update the variable. So we can do sparkle num from 10 to 20, and that's going to be what is animating now instead of just repainting it. And so we get the same effect, but we can apply changes that we want to this element. So it's a little bit more specific and it's a little bit better organized that way. Sweet. So I'm going to very quickly talk about extra.css, which is a fun little library that I've been working on, where I'm applying some of these updates and changes and want to make it consumable. So the first thing is that you can do the super underline. So the way this works is you set the number of underlines, the color, the width, the spread. There's a scallop border, so you can make this sort of like fun little scallopy edge, and then apply that to your links or headers, things like that. I don't know, it's silly. Cross that out. That's another thing you can do, sort of just crossing things out. Like you can play with it and make it like really weird and like, I don't know. I like having fun with the web. So this is like something that is not ready, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. Don't be a jerk. Don't share this link. But it's a Houdini library, and I like kind of showing this because you could see the updates and the changes that are really dynamic in the browser, changing the height, the weight of these sparkles, updating sort of these scallops, the radius of it. You can do some like really fun, funky things. The underline, again, like you can make it thicker. You can update the width of it. You can update the spread. And so this is just kind of like a for funsies thing that I've sort of been thinking about. That's a work in progress, but how I sort of envision people can use Houdini and sort of import it where they need it and style the web in the way they need to, just directly through CSS. So I wrote a little song. I don't know if I have time to sing it. Okay, great, I have time to sing it. Do you all know who Ariana Grande is? I should have started with that. So she wrote a song called Thank You Next, and I rewrote it for Houdini. And yeah, why not? I'll sing it. I'm known for my bad singing on my podcast. I do very bad code songs every other week. So I'll give this a go. Please leave if you're embarrassed or don't want to hear me sing. I thought I'd try out Bootstrap, but it wasn't a match. Made a website with stylus. Now I've used Source and Laugh. Even almost went native. For CSS I'm so thankful. Wish I could say thank you to WebGL. I still don't understand though. One taught me love. One taught me build patience. One taught me pain. Now my page looks amazing. I've learned and I've shipped, but